Welcome to Reflect with Ed Fassio. Get ready to experience one of the world's first 100% digitally generated podcasts, where we take a step back, dive deep, and strive to learn new things. Join us as we unpack thought-provoking ideas, personal reflections, and inspiring stories to help you stay in the know. Reflect is brought to you by the minds at ByteBrain and powered by emerging technologies from Google, HeyGen, OpenAI, and 11 Labs. Thanks for tuning in. Now, relax and prepare to reflect.
Hey there, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that's unfortunately been in the news a lot lately: school safety in America.
Yeah, it's a heavy one for sure, but, it's crucial we understand it better.
Absolutely. And to do that, we've got a whole mix of sources for you today. We've got expert articles, government documents, news reports, and even some personal stories to really bring it all to life.
It's going to be a deep dive for sure.
Now, before we get into the specifics, here's a stat that really caught my eye. Over 3/4 of Americans believe things in the country are heading in the wrong direction. And one of the biggest reasons is fear of gun violence, including in schools. This was from a recent CBS News poll, and it really sets the stage for our deep dive today.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how much this issue is weighing on people's minds.
Right. So let's start by unpacking this whole idea of what makes a school dangerous.
Sure.
It's not always as simple as just physical violence.
That's a great point. Some of our sources, especially the research from Alfred University, highlight that feeling unsafe can be just as damaging as actual incidents. Bullying, mental health struggles, all of those contribute to a negative environment.
Yeah, it's about the overall atmosphere, right? Like, even if there hasn't been a major incident, if students don't feel safe, that's a problem in itself.
Exactly. And then there's this legal term that gets thrown around: persistently dangerous. It sounds really intense, and it comes from the No Child Left Behind Act.
Okay, so break that down for us. What does that label actually mean for a school?
Well, essentially, it means a school has met specific criteria for serious incidents 2 years in a row. We're talking homicides, sexual offenses, weapons, things that severely disrupt the learning environment and put people at risk. Now, the NCLB Act allows students to transfer out of those schools to find safer options.
That makes sense on the surface, but I'm guessing it's not always that straightforward in practice.
You're right to be skeptical. The interesting thing is how persistently dangerous gets defined. It varies from state to state. An article from Education Week pointed out how South Dakota, for example, has only 2 schools with this label. And they're the only ones west of the Ohio River to have it.
Wow, just 2 in the entire state. That's wild.
Right. So it makes you wonder what's going on in other states. Are they not reporting accurately, or are their standards different? And how does your state approach this whole labeling system? It's a good example of how even when there's a law, the reality on the ground can be quite different.
For sure. And let's not forget that beyond these legal definitions, it's the students' experiences that matter most. It's heartbreaking to read that over 25% of students, according to that Alfred University study, don't feel completely safe at school. That's a huge number.
It really is. And it speaks to the urgency of figuring out what's causing these feelings of unsafety and what we can do to change them.
Exactly. So let's dig into those root causes a bit. It seems like there's rarely just one thing that makes a school unsafe, right? It's more complicated than that.
Absolutely. Our sources point to a bunch of interconnected factors. We've got socioeconomic issues, the mental health crisis among young people, and even the influence of the surrounding community. It's a whole web.
Okay, let's unpack that web then. What kind of socioeconomic factors are we talking about?
Well, think about schools in underfunded areas. They often lack the resources to provide adequate support staff, have larger class sizes, and struggle to offer enriching extracurriculars. This can create an environment where problems are more likely to fester.
It's like a domino effect. If the basic needs aren't being met, it's harder to create a positive and safe learning environment.
Exactly. And then there's the mental health crisis. Many schools are simply not equipped to deal with the rising rates of anxiety, depression, and trauma that students are facing. Without proper support, these struggles can manifest in disruptive or even dangerous behaviors.
We actually have a very real example of this in our sources. The NBC News video tells the story of Jacob Cantu, a student in Connecticut, who was injured when someone threw a trash can over a bathroom stall, hitting him in the head.
That's right. And his story isn't just about the physical injury. It's about the climate of fear that led to the incident. The school was so on edge that the superintendent actually had to close the school and go remote for a day. It's a powerful illustration of how mental health issues can impact the entire school community.
Wow, to shut down the entire school, that's a huge decision. It really underscores how serious this issue is.
Definitely. And it's not just about what's happening inside the school building. Our sources also mention how high crime neighborhoods can directly affect school safety. Cities like Detroit and Chicago are grappling with this, where the external environment spills over into the schools.
So it's a reminder that schools are part of a larger ecosystem and they're influenced by the community around them.
Precisely. And we can't forget about the ripple effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. That added a whole other layer of complexity.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The extended periods of social isolation and the disruption to routine had a huge impact on students' mental health and behavior.
Right. The NBC News report even quotes a superintendent who said, being away from the school building had that big an impact? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The return to in-person learning brought a surge in behavioral issues and even violence as students struggled to readjust.
It's almost like we're still dealing with the aftershocks of the pandemic, even in our schools. So with all these intertwined causes, what are we seeing in terms of legislative responses? Has the government stepped in to address this?
Well, the NCLB Act itself, with that persistently dangerous label, was one attempt, but there's a lot of debate about its effectiveness.
Right, we touched on that a bit earlier.
Yeah, some argue that it's too focused on punishment rather than providing real support to struggling schools. Even the National Education Association, NEA, has criticized this aspect of the law.
So good intentions maybe, but not necessarily the best execution. It sounds like a theme we keep encountering.
Unfortunately, yeah. Then there's the whole history of zero-tolerance policies in schools. The aim was to create a stricter environment, but these policies often backfired. They've been heavily criticized for disproportionately impacting students of color and feeding into the school-to-prison pipeline.
It's that age-old problem of unintended consequences. By trying to solve one problem, you end up creating another.
Exactly. And the question of increased security measures is another tricky one. Many schools have implemented things like metal detectors and armed resource officers. But while they can provide a sense of safety, they also risk creating a more prison-like atmosphere, which can have its own negative impacts.
It's such a delicate balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
You want to make schools safe, but you also don't want to sacrifice a positive and welcoming learning environment in the process.
Right. And it raises the question, what's the trade-off? Is there a way to achieve both?
I guess that's what we're trying to figure out with this deep dive. But before we get too bogged down in the challenges, let's shift gears a bit and look at some glimmers of hope. Are there schools out there that are finding solutions and making a positive impact?
There are, and that's what's so encouraging.
Okay, tell us about those. What are they doing differently?
Well, one of the most promising trends is a focus on prevention and intervention programs. Instead of just reacting to incidents after they happen, these programs try to address the root causes of violence and conflict before they escalate.
So things like conflict resolution, anti-bullying initiatives, mental health awareness programs, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And some schools are having success with restorative justice practices, which focus on repairing harm and rebuilding relationships within the community. It's a more holistic approach to discipline, where the goal is to find solutions that benefit everyone involved, rather than just punishing the student who messed up.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about fostering a sense of accountability and empathy rather than just resorting to punitive measures.
Right. And speaking of fostering a positive environment, our sources also highlight the importance of investing in mental health services and support systems.
That goes back to what we were saying earlier about the mental health crisis, right? If schools can provide access to counselors, social workers, psychologists, that can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that students' mental and emotional well-being is just as important as their academic success. And when schools prioritize mental health, they often see a decrease in disruptive behavior and violence.
It's all connected, isn't it? And speaking of inspiring stories, I was really struck by the example of Principal Linda Wayman at Strawberry Mansion High School. She completely turned around a school that was considered one of the most dangerous in Philadelphia.
Oh, that's an incredible story. She really went above and beyond. Instead of focusing on strict rules and punishment, she emphasized building relationships with her students, showing them love and understanding, and creating a true sense of community. And it worked. The school transformed into a place where students felt safe, supported, and inspired to learn.
That's amazing. It shows that even in the toughest environments, change is possible when you approach it with compassion and genuine care.
It's a powerful reminder that human connection can be the most effective tool we have. But even with these hopeful examples, we need to be realistic about the challenges of gathering accurate data. It's not always easy to get a clear picture of what's really happening in schools, is it?
Right. So what are some of the data-related obstacles we need to be aware of?
Well, one of the biggest problems is underreporting. Schools might downplay incidents to avoid getting that persistently dangerous label to protect their reputation, or even because they just don't have the resources to deal with reporting everything.
So we might be missing a big part of the story if schools aren't reporting accurately.
Exactly. And even when schools do report, there's no standardized system across the board. What's considered a violent incident in one school might not be classified the same way in another.
So comparing data across different schools and states becomes really difficult. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces and different shaped edges.
Yeah, it's a real data dilemma. And this makes it harder to identify trends, allocate resources effectively, and measure the impact of different interventions. It's crucial to be aware of this limitation as we evaluate the information we have.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder to think critically about the data we're presented with and to consider the potential gaps in the story.
Right. And it also highlights the need for more transparency and standardized reporting methods. If we want to truly understand the scope of the problem and find effective solutions, we need reliable data to guide us.
So let's zoom out a bit and consider the bigger picture. How does the U.S. stack up against other countries in terms of school safety? Are we facing a unique set of challenges?
It's a really interesting question, and one of our sources, a video from Deutsche Welle, compares school safety in the U.S. to Germany. And the contrast is pretty striking.
Really? What did you learn?
Well, apparently it's extremely rare to see security guards or lockdown drills in German schools. Students there generally report feeling safe and don't express the same level of worry about violence or shootings that we see here.
That's a huge difference.
It is, and it suggests that there might be something unique about American culture. Things like the widespread availability of guns, or even a cultural acceptance of violence as a means of resolving conflict that contributes to our struggles with school safety.
It's a sobering thought, but definitely something to ponder. So we've covered a lot of ground already, and I'm curious, are there any specific details from the sources that really stood out to you? Anything that's surprised you or made you think differently about this whole issue?
You know what really stuck with me was the story of Strawberry Mansion High School and Principal Wayman's transformative leadership. It's a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, human connection and compassion can make a real difference. It gives me hope that positive change is possible even in the most difficult circumstances.
I totally agree. Her story is a powerful antidote to all the negativity surrounding this issue. It shows that while we have a lot of work to do, there are people out there who are finding ways to create safer and more supportive learning environments for their students.
Exactly, and I think that's a good place to wrap up part one of our deep dive. We've explored the complexities of defining a dangerous school, delved into the web of root causes, and examined some of the legislative responses, both their strengths and shortcomings. But we've also seen that there are reasons for hope. There are schools and communities out there that are finding solutions and making a positive impact.
Well said. So join us for part two, where we'll continue this conversation and explore more deeply the data, the legislative landscape, and the search for effective solutions. It's a topic that deserves our continued attention and action.
Looking forward to it. So picking up where we left off, let's dig into some specific data from our sources. The Fast Facts School Crime Report gives us a pretty interesting snapshot. It breaks down different types of incidents, shows how things vary by location, and even highlights how reporting methods can affect the numbers we see.
Okay, let's unpack that. What kind of data are we looking at here?
Well, first, there's data on school-associated violent deaths, which are thankfully rare. Between the 1992-93 school year and the 2019-20 school year, the number fluctuated between 25 and 63 per year. It's a reminder that even one such incident is a tragedy.
Absolutely. But those numbers only tell part of the story, right? What about non-fatal incidents?
Right. We also have data on non-fatal student victimization. Interestingly, it shows a decrease between 2019 and 2021, both in school and away from school. But there's a caveat here. The pandemic likely played a role. Lots of kids were learning remotely during that time.
So it's hard to tell if that decrease is a genuine improvement or just a reflection of the unusual circumstances.
Exactly. And it underscores the importance of considering context when we look at data like this.
Okay, so we have data on deaths, non-fatal incidents, But what about other types of crime and violence that might not fall into those categories?
That's where the data on school reports of violence and crime becomes really interesting. In the 2019-20 school year, a staggering 77% of public schools reported at least one crime.
77%. That's a huge number.
It is, but here's where it gets even more interesting. Only 47% of those schools actually reported those incidents to law enforcement.
Wait, less than half of the schools that experienced crime actually reported it to the police. Why is that?
There are a few possible explanations. Some schools may choose to handle certain incidents internally through their own disciplinary procedures. Others might be hesitant to involve law enforcement because they're worried about the potential consequences for students, especially students of color.
So it could be a mix of factors.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it creates a situation where we might not have a complete picture of the problem, right?
Exactly. And this discrepancy in reporting is especially noticeable when it comes to certain types of incidents. For example, while 70% of public schools recorded at least one violent incident, only 32% reported a violent incident to law enforcement.
Wow, that's a big gap.
Right.
It makes you wonder about the accuracy of the data we have and how much is going unreported.
Right. It underscores the need for clear reporting guidelines and for encouraging schools to report all incidents regardless of severity. Without accurate data, it's much harder to address the problem effectively.
It's like trying to navigate a maze in the dark. You need a reliable map to find your way out.
Exactly. And then there's data on students' perceptions of safety, which is really important too. In 2019, about 5% of students ages 12 to 18 reported feeling afraid of attack or harm at school, and 3% reported the same fear away from school.
So even if the overall number of violent incidents is relatively low, there's still a significant percentage of students who don't feel safe. And that feeling can have a real impact on their well-being and ability to learn.
Absolutely. A school can't be considered truly safe if students are constantly living with fear and anxiety.
Okay, so we've talked about violence and crime, but the Fast Facts report also touches on drug availability, specifically marijuana. What did you find there?
Well, in 2019, about 22% of high school students reported using marijuana at least once in the past 30 days. And a similar percentage said illegal drugs were made available to them on school property.
So it seems like there might be a connection between drug use and drug availability.
It definitely suggests that. And it highlights the need for strong drug prevention programs in schools.
Of course, it's important to remember that all this data is from 2019. Things might have shifted since then, especially with the pandemic and its effects on students' lives.
That's a great point. We're looking at a snapshot in time, and ongoing research is essential to track how these trends evolve.
So we've delved into the data, but what about the legislative efforts to address school safety? We touched on the No Child Left Behind Act, but what other laws have been passed?
Well, NCLB was a big one, but it's not the whole story. It was meant to improve education overall, including school safety, through accountability measures like standardized testing and reporting requirements for incidents of violence and crime.
Right, and it also allowed students in persistently dangerous schools to transfer to safer ones.
Exactly. But as we discussed earlier, there's been a lot of debate about the effectiveness of NCLB.
Right. Groups like the NEA argued that it was too focused on punishment and relied too heavily on standardized tests, which they said narrowed the curriculum and created a culture of fear in schools.
Exactly. And that criticism eventually led to NCLB being replaced by the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESA, in 2015.
So how is ESA different?
It's to keep some accountability measures, but gives states more flexibility in how they implement them. It also shifts some focus away from standardized testing to other factors like student engagement and school climate.
So it's an evolution of the federal approach to education. It'll be interesting to see how it continues to shape the landscape of school safety.
Definitely. And it's important to remember that federal laws are just one piece of the puzzle. States and local districts also have their own policies and initiatives that address school safety, often reflecting the specific needs and concerns of their communities.
Right, so it's a patchwork of approaches across the country.
It is. And some states might prioritize things like gun control measures, while others might focus on mental health services or bullying prevention. The effectiveness of these policies likely depends on various factors, including funding, implementation, and community support.
And of course, we run into that data challenge again. It's hard to evaluate the effectiveness of these various policies if we don't have consistent data collection and analysis across the board.
Absolutely. It's a recurring theme in this discussion, and it highlights the need for better communication and collaboration between different levels of government, researchers, policymakers, and those actually working in schools.
It sounds like a huge, complex system with lots of moving parts. But we've also seen some positive examples of individual schools making a difference, like Principal Wayman's story.
Exactly. And that brings up an important point. We've been focusing on the roles of schools in government, but what about the role of parents and the community in all this?
That's a great question. It can't just fall on the schools to solve this, right?
Absolutely not. School safety requires a collective effort. Parents play a vital role in fostering a culture of safety and respect at home, talking to their kids about bullying, conflict resolution, and the dangers of violence. They can monitor their kids' online activity and look out for any warning signs.
It's about creating a supportive and open environment where kids feel comfortable talking about these issues.
Exactly. And communities can support schools by providing resources, advocating for policy changes, and creating safe spaces for young people outside of school hours.
It really does take a village to create a truly safe environment for kids.
It does. And when schools, families, and communities work together, they can achieve amazing things. They can create a culture where students feel valued, supported, and empowered to thrive.
So as we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, it seems like a key takeaway is that school safety isn't just about physical security measures or laws. It's about addressing a complex web of factors, working collaboratively, and fostering a sense of community and support.
I think that's a great way to put it. And it leads us into part 3, where we'll delve further into potential solutions, successful programs, and the role of technology in shaping the future of school safety.
Sounds good to me. Join us for part 3, where we'll continue this important conversation. Welcome back to part 3 of our deep dive into school safety. We've covered a lot of ground, from the data and the legislative landscape to the importance of community involvement. So now let's shift our focus to solutions. What's actually working to make schools safer?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And as we've seen, there's no magic bullet. But there are definitely some promising approaches and some common threads in the programs that are having success.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of those key ingredients?
Well, a lot of it comes down to addressing the root causes of violence and disruption, not just reacting after something bad has already happened. This means tackling issues like poverty, lack of resources, and mental health challenges head-on.
So it's about shifting from a reactive approach to a more proactive, preventative one.
Exactly, and successful programs often emphasize early intervention and support, recognizing that catching problems early can prevent them from, snowballing into something much bigger.
It makes sense. If you can create an environment where students feel comfortable seeking help, you might be able to intervene before the situation reaches a crisis point.
Right. And early intervention often involves things like providing access to mental health services, counseling, and social-emotional learning programs. These programs help equip students with the skills they need to manage their emotions, build healthy relationships, and resolve conflicts peacefully.
So it's not just about academics. It's about teaching kids those essential life skills that can help them navigate challenges and make good choices.
Absolutely. And another common element in successful programs is a focus on building those positive school climates. This involves fostering a sense of community belonging and respect within the school.
I like that. So how do you actually create this kind of positive school climate? What does it look like in practice?
Well, it's about going beyond just rules and punishments and creating a culture where everyone feels valued, respected, and connected to their peers and teachers. It might involve implementing anti-bullying programs, peer mediation initiatives, or restorative justice practices.
It's about shifting from a punitive approach to one that emphasizes rehabilitation and inclusion.
Exactly. And we saw a powerful example of this with Principal Linda Wayman's story at Strawberry Mansion High School. She really understood the importance of building relationships and creating a culture of love and understanding.
Yeah, her story was truly inspiring. It showed that even in incredibly challenging environments, positive change is possible.
It's a good reminder that human connection can be a powerful force for good. But let's be realistic. Creating these kinds of changes takes time, effort, and resources. Are there any quick fixes? Maybe using technology that can help improve school safety.
That's a question a lot of people are asking these days.
It is. And while technology can be a valuable tool, it's important to approach it with a critical eye. It's not a silver bullet.
So it's not as simple as just installing metal detectors or security cameras and calling it a day.
Right. Technology should be seen as a complement to, not a replacement for, those other strategies we talked about. Prevention programs, positive school climates.
It's about using technology strategically and thoughtfully as part of a multifaceted approach.
Exactly. So let's look at some ways technology is being used to enhance school safety. One area is surveillance. Many schools now have extensive security camera systems that can monitor hallways, classrooms, and other areas.
It's like having an extra set of eyes, which could be helpful in deterring crime and providing evidence if something does happen. But what about privacy concerns? Don't all those cameras feel a bit Big Brother-ish?
That's a legitimate concern. It's crucial for schools to have clear policies about how that footage is used and accessed. Transparency and accountability are key.
Absolutely. You want to use technology to improve safety without creating an environment that feels oppressive or violates students' privacy.
Right. And another area where technology is being used is access control. Many schools use electronic key cards or biometric systems to control who can enter certain areas.
It's about creating layers of security to make it harder for unauthorized individuals to get into the school.
Exactly. And then you have some newer technologies like gun detection software, which can analyze security camera footage to identify the presence of firearms.
Wow, that sounds pretty high-tech.
Yeah.
But does it actually work?
It's still a developing technology, and there are questions about its accuracy and potential for bias. But it's definitely an area worth watching, as it could potentially play a role in preventing tragedies like school shootings.
It sounds like a delicate balance, though.
Yeah.
You want to use technology to prevent harm, but you also don't want to create a school environment that feels like a prison.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have those open and honest conversations about the role of technology in school safety. We need to weigh the potential benefits against the risks and make informed decisions that prioritize the well-being of all students.
So as we've seen throughout this deep dive, school safety is a complex issue with no easy answers. But it's also an issue that demands our attention and action. What are some final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that school safety isn't just a school issue. It's a community issue. It requires a collective effort from parents, educators, policymakers, law enforcement, and the community at large. We need to work together, share information, and learn from each other's successes and failures. And we need to be willing to challenge the status quo and advocate for solutions that prioritize the well-being of all students.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final question to ponder. We've seen the statistics on the rise in school shootings. Given that sobering reality, what role can each of us play as individuals and as members of our communities to advocate for change and create a safer future for our children? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a better understanding of the complexities of school safety and inspired you to get involved in creating positive change. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.